What is up, YouTube? Today I'm coming back at you with another tabletop RPG video, and today's video is going to be another video about Fantasy Age, but mainly this is going to be a more comparison video, a comparison type review of Fantasy Age. So we're going to be taking a look at Fantasy Age compared to 5th edition Dungeons & Dragons. And how does Fantasy Age compare to 5th edition Dungeons & Dragons? What are the similarities? What are the differences? What do you need to play? Just stuff like that, and basically taking a full-on look on how this game compares to that game, and if this is a good option for you or not, or if that's a better option for you. Now, why am I doing this video? Many people, when they first get into fantasy RPGs, most of them go straight to D&D. Why is that? It has the name recognition, it's fairly accessible, you can find products everywhere, but not everybody takes to D&D like, not everybody gets into D&D as much as other games, and a lot of times people will stop playing RPGs because they think that they're all like D&D, which is not the case. So we're going to be taking a look at one of the alternatives and how it stacks up compared to the 5th edition of Dungeons & Dragons, which is the most popular RPG of all time, arguably. So, first things first, let's talk about some of the similarities of Fantasy Age and 5th edition Dungeons & Dragons. So, what are the similarities? First, the biggest similarity between these two games is they're both fantasy tabletop role-playing games. Obviously, they are covering the same genre and sort of the same niche. So you're going to get very similar. You can tell very similar stories with either of these games. So if you wanted to say play a Lord of the Rings like game, you can do that with either of these games. Say you wanted to play something a little bit more obscure or a little bit more out there, you can do that as well. You can pretty much make your own homebrew stuff. You can do any sort of fantasy setting with both of these games perfectly fine, and they will function perfectly fine. Another similarity between these two games is they're both rules medium games. What does that mean? Well, there's three different categories that are out there in terms of rules for games, in my opinion. There's rules light games, which rules light games are games with very few rules, as the name suggests. Basically, you only really get rules for combat and maybe for skills type encounters, but other than that, a lot of it's left up to the GM to make the rules and make the rolls, and everything's pretty much up to the GM and your imagination at that point. So there's not a lot of rules in a rules light game. There's rules medium games, and then there's rules heavy games. Obviously, rules mediums games, they have rules for all combat and skill-like encounters and some exploration type stuff, and it doesn't bog you down too much with rules, but it doesn't leave you hanging with, oh, you have to make up all these different rules. So it's kind of like a middle ground between rules heavy, which has rules for everything, including like different types of combat, and for instance, Pathfinder has rules for grappling, which is different than normal combat rules. So it sort of strikes that middle ground between easy to learn from rules light and also complexity of rules heavy, where you get to customize your character a bunch. So it's kind of that middle ground, and both of these games fit in that general proximity. What are some other similarities between these games? They both use same sort of general class outline, although there are less classes in Fantasy Age, kind of, and then there's more kind of classes in D&D. But you have your same main races, your same main classes between the two, and so you can kind of get the same character builds with either of them. The way you go about it's a bit different, but for the most part you can build the same sort of characters with either system. So that pretty much, oh yeah, they're also both hardcover books, which are really nice. Hardcover books are really what you want with tabletop RPGs, so they last a really long time. And yeah, so that pretty much covers most of the similarities, the biggest similarities in my opinion, between these two games. So let's go into the differences between these two games. And first we'll cover what do you need to play these games. So, and I'm talking about, in my opinion, the necessities for running the game, because the assumption is that you're going to teach your friends how to play, and so you're going to be running the game as the GM or Dungeon Master if you're playing 5th edition. So let's go over what you'll need to run the game for each individual game. So we'll start off with for 5th edition Dungeons and Dragons. So the first thing you're going to need is your player's handbook. This is the book that has all the rules for combat, has all the rules for character creation, has rules for classes, skills, anything that you're going to need to know as a player is going to be in this book. And most of the rules for running the game are also in this book as well. Now, this book doesn't cover anything for the Dungeon Master. Well, it covers some stuff for the Dungeon Master, but the majority of the stuff is just player-oriented materials. The second book you'll need, in my opinion, will be the Monster Manual, as the Player's Handbook has a very limited selection of creatures. In fact, most of them are just familiars. The Monster Manual contains, this is just a book of monsters that you can throw in your campaign. It has, a good sizable amount of monsters, and pretty much all of your standard tropes are in there, and everything that you're going to want is in there. And the last book I think you'll want as well is the Dungeon Master's Guide. Now, the Dungeon Master's Guide is full of more rules, but these are optional rules, a lot of them. So you have a lot of different optional rules in the Dungeon Master's Guide that you may want to tweak your game with. You have a lot of setting material, which I'll get into in a second, and you'll have a lot of, more non-common rules. So the Player's Handbook really covers most of the common rules that the players are going to use on a day-to-day basis. The Dungeon Master's Guide is going to have a lot of rules that are going to be, every once in a while you'll need to look in the Dungeon Master's Guide for rules. A lot of it is how to build your campaign and stuff along those lines, and a lot of setting material for the setting of Dungeons & Dragons 5th edition. The last thing you'll need is a set of dice, and Dungeons & Dragons uses a standard RPG set, or what would be considered standard now, 7 set of polyhedral dice, including a D20, a D6, a D8, a D12, 2 D10s, one with tens place and one with a standard single place, and your D4. This is also known as a percentile die as well. So those are the 7 dice that you will need to play Dungeons & Dragons 5th edition, and that's pretty much everything you'll need to play this game. Now, let's look at, in my opinion, the things you'll need to play Fantasy Age. So the first thing you'll need for Fantasy Age is the basic rulebook. Now, the basic rulebook contains pretty much almost everything you need to play, in my opinion. It has a section for Game Masters. It has all of your character creation rules, all of your combat rules, how to play different skill encounters, how to buy equipment, all that stuff. And it also lumps in your Game Master section. So you have how to build your world, how to build encounters, how to, some of the optional rules, and there's also a sample adventure in the back of the book. In addition to that, I also think there's a small set of monsters in there as well. You think you have maybe 24 or something around that many monsters, so there's not a lot of monsters in there. Therefore, in my opinion, the second book you'll need to absolutely run this game is the Bestiary. Now, the Bestiary is just like the Monster Manual in 5th edition, just a book of monsters. And I think these two are the only 2 books you'll need to run this game comfortably. So that right there shows you one big difference between these 2 games. You need 1 less book, and also the books are cheaper. The standard price for these books are anywhere from $35 to $32 per book. Depending on which book you're getting, they kind of fluctuate in price, but that's full retail price on those. So about $35 per book, full retail price. The Dungeons & Dragons books, these books right here cost you around $50 full retail price per book. So quite a bit more expensive. In addition to that, you'll also need to buy a special set of dice. The polyhedral dice for 5th edition will cost you around $8 if you get a cheap set. Now, the last thing you'll need to run Fantasy Age is 3 D6 style dice. One of them will need to be a different color, and that will be your stunt dice. We'll get into that later when we talk about the rules, but these are the only 3 dice you'll need to run the game. It is helpful to have more D6s, because this only uses D6s, which is a big difference between Dungeons and Dragons and Fantasy Age is this only uses D6s, and 5th edition primarily uses the D20. So this is basically what you'll be rolling for most of your combat rolls, your skill rolls, stuff like that. You're going to be mainly using these 3 D6 dice with the special colored one as well. So the nice thing about using the D6s is many games, if you already own board games, will already use D6s, so you don't really necessarily need to buy dice if you already have 2 different colored dice that you can find for D6s, which should be fairly common. So that is one advantage for Fantasy Age. Another advantage is the price point, like I said. So in about total, you're looking at about $70 for both books, whereas if you buy full retail price 5th edition books, which I'm not saying they don't go on sale, they obviously do go on sale, but if you're buying from a bookstore, full retail price, you're looking at about $150 for the D&D books, whereas you're only looking at $70 for the Fantasy Age books. So there's a significant cost savings going with Fantasy Age. Another, let's get this out of the way. So we'll get the 5th edition Player's Handbook back out there. Another big difference between these two games is setting. So 5th edition Dungeons & Dragons takes place, it has a built-in setting for the game where you can adventure in the Forgotten Realms or the Sword Coast, or there's a couple other settings that they've got that you can adventure in for 5th edition Dungeons & Dragons. And a lot of the lore is built into the classes, and there's in this book you have some descriptions of gods and stuff like that. So if you are looking for a game that has some of the legwork for building a world already done for you, 5th edition Dungeons & Dragons will have some setting material and stuff like that in the 3 main core books that you can use. Fantasy Age, on the other hand, is a setting generic game, which means that there is no given setting for this game at all. All of the work for building a world and building settings and deities and a story is all going to be up to you in Fantasy Age. But the benefit of that is there is no ingrained there's no ingrained rules for different classes and races. You can basically mold it however you would like. If you wanted to do that with 5th edition, it is still possible, but it does take a little bit of work to remove some of those setting details from the game. Not a lot, but there's a little bit of work involved there. That work is eliminated with the setting generic system. So it's really up to what you prefer in that aspect. Do you want a game that gives you just the tools to create a world, a fantasy world, or do you want a game that gives you a fantasy world to play in? That's just something that you're going to have to decide for yourself. In my personal preference, I prefer a generic fantasy toolbox. Don't get me wrong, I do love 5th edition. I'm not trying to say I love both of these games. I'm not trying to say that they are not both great games, but and if I had to pick a preference, I do prefer not having a setting built in, because I like to build my own worlds myself. Alright, so let's also take a look at classes in these games. So, in Fantasy Age, there are 3 main classes that you can play as. Let me flip the pages here. Alright, so the first class you can play as is a mage, and it has all the rules for leveling up to all the way to level 20 on these 2 pages. Second is a rogue, and lastly, you have your warrior. And they all kind of follow the similar format in terms of layout, where it gives you basically. The nice thing about this layout that I like is everything you'll need to know for every level is in each individual section. So like, you don't need to look at any of this stuff until you get to that level. I like the way that it's set up in that sense, and I really like that a lot. But there are 3 classes. Now, the way that you customize your character is a little bit different. So if you look here, at level 4 it says you can choose your specialization. So the main way that you customize your character in Fantasy Age is through specialization. So once you reach level 4, you play your first 3 levels as a generic warrior, generic mage, or generic rogue. And then when you reach level 4, you can sort of specialize into a new type of class. And that'll sort of tweak your base warrior, your base mage, or your base rogue into a certain sense that, that you want. So let's go to specializations. If I can find it. There we go. So specializations. So you have various different types of specializations, but each specialization has slightly different, benefits and disadvantages. So you have like an assassin. You can get, if you're a rogue, you can go into an assassin for your specialization. You can go to a duelist or a berserker, elementalist, and there's quite a number of more options. And then there are other books that offer additional specializations as well. But that is the main way that you customize your character in Fantasy Age. Now, additionally, you also have your base races. Now, this is also another difference from Dungeons & Dragons 5th edition. Yes, you have the same sort of spread of races. You have your dwarf, you have your elf, you have your gnome, halfling, human, and orc. Now, what makes these different than 5th edition, however, is the benefits table. When you create your character, you'll roll on these tables, and those will give you a different benefit for each roll. So that means that every orc in your party could potentially have different bonuses and different specializations from their race. That is something that you don't get in 5th edition. That is a difference. In 5th edition, pull the book back out here. So in 5th edition, your classes that you can play, we did the classes first last time. Alright, so your classes you can play a barbarian, a bard, a cleric, a druid, a fighter, a monk, a paladin, a ranger, a rogue, a sorcerer, a warlock, or a wizard. And that's just in the base book. Now, the way you customize your character in 5th edition is a little bit different. You don't have specializations like you do in Fantasy Age. You have archetypes is what they call them. But I don't really, they're not archetypes in the same way as Pathfinder. They're more of just like a branching path kind of pick. So these different sections here, these are different things that you get at different levels. Each section, they kind of organize it sort of similarly to Fantasy Age, but they don't list them like level 1 section. They just kind of list the powers' names, and they list them in order of what time you get them. Like, so Primal Champion's at a level 20 ability, and that's listed last, whereas Rage is a first level ability for a Barbarian, and that is listed first. Now, like I said, customization is done through these different paths, or archetypes as they like to call them, and you have, I think that's where the, let's switch to the Ranger, because I actually know the Ranger better. If I can find it. Alright, so Ranger. So right here you have, it says Ranger archetypes. So there's 2 archetypes here. You have Hunter and Beastmaster, and these kind of are similar to, Fantasy Age, but not exactly. In Fantasy Age, at level 20, you should have 2 different specializations. So you'll actually have your 2 specializations giving you powers, plus your base class that gives you powers. In 5th edition Dungeons & Dragons, when you go into your archetype, you basically stick to the archetype for the entire duration of your character. So you'll just go through and you'll get these powers as you level up. So it's kind of, just like I said, more of a branching path instead of an add-on type of setup. But like I said, you have your basic different classes. So let's get to the races now. Now your races, the difference is even more apparent in races, in my opinion. Alright, so your races are Dwarf, Elf, keep going, Halfling, Human, Dragonborn, Gnome, Half-Elf, Half-Orc, Tiefling, and that's it. So those are all the races you can be. You have your standard spread in both of them, but 5th edition does have a couple extra ones thrown in there, like the Tiefling and the Dragonborn, but other than that, they're pretty much all similar. Now, the biggest difference between the two race setups is, like I said, pretty much every Tiefling is going to be the same in Dungeons and Dragons. So you don't have like the benefits table. Pretty much every Tiefling is going to get the same mechanical benefits as every other Tiefling. So that's one difference there. Now, in terms of the way that let's talk a little bit about the way the rules play themselves. So, in terms of combat, Fantasy Age uses a yard-based system. So each square represents a yard, and then, for instance, a character can move 12 yards. Well, most characters can move like 12 yards. So yeah, you'll just measure out your 12 spaces and then move. Dungeons & Dragons 5th edition uses feet. Now the way that the grid works for feet is you have 5 feet per square, and on average your players can move about 30 feet, so 6 squares. So you'll measure out your 6 and then you move. So that's one big difference. For Fantasy Age, you're going to need a larger grid, especially if you're doing very large encounters, because your characters are going to be able to move much further on a grid space than Dungeons & Dragons 5th edition. You can play both of these games without a grid just as easily for both, but if you are using a grid with combat, like the one I have here, Fantasy Age will require a little bit of a larger one. In terms of actual combat rules, the way that a combat roll works in Fantasy Age is you choose your target, you roll your 3d6, and you compare that to their defense, and that'll tell you if you hit or not. If you roll doubles, you get to choose a stunt from the stunt system, which is how they do their criticals, which is a difference between these two games. So in Fantasy Age, you have the stunt system, but like I said, when you roll doubles, whatever this special color dice has on it, that's how many points you get to spend that round. You have to use them all in that round. And there's a list of stunts that you can do, such as moving a target, attacking a second time, and stuff like that. And that's sort of how you would do like a critical hit. It's not really a critical, it's just a mechanic of the game. They don't call it criticals because it doesn't function the exact same way. In Dungeons & Dragons, and then you would roll your damage, which is normally like a set amount of d6s plus whatever your strength is. In 5th edition, the way that a combat roll works is you roll your d20, add any of your additional modifiers. If you roll a natural 20, that's a critical hit, and then you do your multiply damage normally by 2, and that's how you do a critical hit. Damage can range anywhere from d8s, d6s are pretty popular, all the way up to a d12 for some really, really strong weapons. But then you add your additional modifiers that way. So it's up to you which combat system you think sounds easier, but that's a generic gist of that. Basically, the target number you're trying to overcome in Dungeons & Dragons is the AC, which is called your armor class. That is your dexterity plus 10 plus whatever armor bonuses you get from your armor. In Fantasy Age, what is different about that is everybody starts with 10 plus their dexterity modifier, and that's their defense. In addition to their defense, you also have a stat called armor. And your armor score is what you get from, obviously, the armor you're wearing. So if you get hit, your armor in Fantasy Age actually absorbs that amount of damage. Say your armor rating is 4. You get hit for 5, you only take 1 damage because your armor absorbs 4. In D&D, your armor just adds to your overall AC, so it doesn't actually absorb any damage. So that's a major mechanical difference between combat for Fantasy Age and 5th edition Dungeons & Dragons. It's up to you which one you think sounds better. It really just depends on your style of play that you want. Other than that, in terms of supplemental material, there's supplemental material for both games. I'm sorry if you see flickering. It's snowing for the first time in Ohio this year, so we're having some power fluctuations. But in terms of supplemental material, there's supplemental material for both games. So for Dungeons & Dragons, you have supplemental material such as additional player options, adventures, and campaign settings. For Fantasy Age, you have supplemental material including more character options, Game Master Toolbox, and there are no adventures. There are supposed to be adventures coming out for this system, but as of right now, there are no pre-made adventures for Fantasy Age. That's up to you if that's a negative or positive. It doesn't really bother me personally because, like I said, I make most of my games homebrew anyway. But if you were looking for a system that has pre-made adventures, you're probably going to want to go with 5th edition. So that pretty much, in my opinion, covers a majority of the differences and similarities of Fantasy Age to Dungeons & Dragons 5th edition. They're both very similar games. They both play very similarly. Mechanics are slightly different amongst both of them. The way they go about it is, like I said, a little bit different. And you just really have to choose which one sounds more interesting to you. They both have options for doing the same sort of things. However, the way they go about it is a little bit different. So the main differences that you're going to notice during play is the D6 system. When you're rolling for skills and whatnot, is all going to be these 3 D6, where those are all going to be rolled on a D20 for 5th edition. So it's up to you which one sounds more interesting. Like I said, I touched on some of the different mechanics for the game, mostly just combat related stuff because that's what you're most likely going to be doing most. But like I said, you can run both these games in a dungeon crawl, in an overworld adventure, and pretty much any generic fantasy setting you should be able to do with both. I hope you guys enjoyed this video and this look at Fantasy Age compared to Dungeons & Dragons 5th edition. Let me know what you guys think in the comment box below, and I hope you guys enjoyed this video, and I'll see you guys next time. Peace.